Hello, and welcome to When Zip Code Doesn't Matter. My name is Jonathan Capelli, and I'm the director of the Neighborhood Development Collaborative. In this module, we are going to look at the economics of race and criminal justice. Now, first, it's important to remember why we're all here. This presentation and the larger national dialogue happening on race today probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, and for the protests of last summer. Now, while housing at first may appear to be a different issue, over the next few slides, we hope to show you just how the seeds sown over generations of de jure or intentional housing injustice in this country are a large contributor to the criminal justice inequities that we face today, as well as what we can do about it. Now, we'll be discussing the police a lot in this section, and we want to stress that while individual officers are often the main targets of criticism in these sort of discourses, there's a lot more to it that merits review. Essentially, the criminal justice system and the larger policies behind and around them that support them do a fundamental disservice to society. In essence, today, we send officers in to confront issues that are actually rooted in a cycle of systemic injustice. We do that with tools that actually only give greater momentum to that cycle at the expense of tools that would make communities safer. Meanwhile, there's a growing body of scholarship and real-life examples both here in Colorado and across the country that show that we can deal with these issues in a much more just and practical and effective way. And we'll get to those in a minute. First, let's take a moment to anchor this dialogue historically. The roots of affordable housing are fundamentally tied to racial justice. During Martin Luther King's final years in Chicago, housing justice was a key platform in his campaign. When he was assassinated, Congress immediately passed the Fair Housing Act, which is a bill to prohibit racial discrimination in housing. However, the roots of racial justice in housing began even before that. One of the first nonprofit affordable housing initiatives with Habitat for Humanity all began in 1940 with Clarence Jordan, its co-founder, when he created housing for impoverished sharecroppers as a response to the segregation and terrible living conditions that were facing Black Americans in his area during that time. Now for this, he and his community were frequent targets of the KKK. So in short, housing justice was a core strategy of the racial justice movement. Let's look at a timeline in the next slide to see why that was. So here's a quick overview, as quick as we could make it, of the history of race-based housing policies in the US. For a more detailed look at some of these issues, please check the other modules in the program. In short though, in the 1860s, as part of an effort to settle land that was taken from Native Americans west of the Mississippi, the US government awarded 270 million acres to anyone who would travel and claim it. Now, rampant discrimination, because this had passed just before the Emancipation Proclamation, really kept Black households from fully participating in this program. This was a long time ago, but today, 20% of all white families can trace their ancestry back to this boon of wealth and home ownership that was literally given to them by the government. In all, 10% of the total land in the United States was given away for free during this time. Then, in the 1940s, you had the GI Bill that was designed to help returning servicemen from World War II. Now, this initiative really helped develop the white middle class, but Black servicemen were rarely beneficiaries of the program due to discrimination. Then, in the 30s to the 70s, you had redlining, where FHA resisted issuing mortgages to Black people in Black or in white neighborhoods. And this put my own great-grandmother, a maid, in a pretty awkward position. As I mentioned earlier, she had to get her loan from the family that she herself cleaned the house of. And for many others who weren't so lucky, it left millions of low and moderate income Black households without the ability to get financing for a home that white people of the same income were able to. Then in 2008 came the Great Recession, which resulted in about 8% of recent Black and Latino homeowners losing their homes due to the fact that they were given subprime mortgages at about 2 times the rate of white households all through the mid-2000s. Through it all, you had NIMBYism, which essentially allowed wealthy and predominantly white residents of high opportunity, richer areas use their political heft to prevent low-income housing, multifamily housing, and other land uses deemed unsavory from being built in their neighborhoods. There was also block busting and the effects of single-family zoning during this time. All these things conspired to create a situation where Black people were systemically denied the benefits of wealth creation and housing stability that were afforded their white counterparts through most of US history. Now, it may come as a little surprise to you that, race aside, we have an extremely dysfunctional criminal justice system. Today, 1 out of every 100 people in the United States is imprisoned, and at 4.5% of the world's population, 1/5 of all prisoners in the world are imprisoned here in the United States. In Colorado, COVID resulted in a record number of releases, but still with 16,000 people in prison, 12,000 on parole, and 87,000 new people booked into jail every year, our state incarceration rate is about the same as El Salvador's. Now, pre-COVID, at about 100,000 people per year, Colorado criminally processed a population the size of Boulder annually. Now let's take a look at how this breaks out by race. This chart shows the racial and ethnic disparities in the prisons and jails of Colorado. And as you can see in the top bar, as 70% of the population, but 44% of the prison population, white people are pretty underrepresented in our prison system. For Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, however, it's the exact opposite. White people in Colorado end up in jail about 30% less often than you would expect if all things were equal, while Latinos, Black, and Native peoples are 1.5, 4.5, and 40 times overrepresented, respectively. Now, a valid response, if you were to look at these numbers, would be to say, well, if they commit more crimes at a higher rate, it makes sense that they would be incarcerated at a higher rate. Well, to respond to that, we really need to look at some of the next slides to understand more fundamentally where crime comes from and how policing practices contribute to arrest rates. This chart shows the incomes of current US prisoners before they were incarcerated. So when you look at this chart, what do you see? Well, your eye might gravitate towards the large portion of people who, before being imprisoned, were unemployed at about 51%. And then you'll see a pattern. The more you make, as you kind of move to the right and upward from the unemployed quadrant, the more you make, the less likely it is that you will be found in prison. Added together, 86.6% of the currently incarcerated made less than $15,000 a year when they were free, and most of them were unemployed. If you make more than $50,000 a year, you're essentially immune from prison. So what does this all tell us? Well, it shows us really that in essence, incarceration is essentially a broad catchment area for the lowest income members of our society. It's society's last and most brutal safety net for anyone who falls off the lowest rung of our social and economic hierarchy. Now, this chart focuses on the correlation between income and incarceration of adults, but it actually goes even deeper than that. This chart shows the imprisonment likelihood, not by income that you would make as an adult, as in the previous slide, but by your parents' income. It shows us that 8% of boys born into the lowest income families in America end up in jail when they reach adulthood. That's the far left side of the chart. And for every step up in income, as you move to the right, the portion of people born into those families that end up in prison shrinks first by 1/3, then by 1/2, then 2/3, and then it levels out at around 1%. So you probably see the connection already. Black and brown people are disproportionately low income due to a history of economic disenfranchisement that we reviewed earlier. In particular, because of a lack of access to home ownership, which has been shown in numerous models to be the chief generator of wealth in this country. Because of that history, home ownership rates for white people are nearly 2 times that of Black people and 1.5 times that of Latinos. And even for those Black and brown households who are homeowners, their homes are often worth a lot less because they tend to live in areas with lower land values, due in part to the redlining, the de jure intentional process that was discussed in previous modules. These factors all combine to result in the average net worth of white households in this country being 7.5 times that of Latino households and 10 times that of Black households. The median income of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people in Colorado is about 60% of that of white people, which is far too low to be able to acquire a home in this market. So we just saw how incarceration is essentially a system for the poorest of the poor, where you're 20 times more likely to end up behind bars than someone with rich parents if your parents were just scraping by. So it's no surprise that the lowest income demographics in our country, Black, Brown, and Native Americans, are so overrepresented in the prison system. Black men in Colorado are arrested about 3 times the rate that they should be based on their population, and about 6 times the rate of white men. It's worth noting that this is not that unique to America. In developed countries around the world with a history of slavery, colonialism, or other discrimination, the most maligned or disenfranchised ethnic minorities are often arrested the most. In New Zealand, the indigenous Maori people are the most arrested. In pre- and post-apartheid South Africa, it's the Black Africans. In Australia, it's Aboriginal peoples. And in Japan, it's people of Brazilian or Chinese descent. At any rate, the politics and economics of wealth and income as they relate to race are a big part of the arrest and police interaction discrepancies that we see today. But they don't tell the full story. For instance, we know that despite consuming illicit drugs at the same rate, Black men are 4 times as likely to be arrested than white men for the exact same crime. We also know that police threaten or use force on Black and Latino people at 2.5 times the rate of white people. And we also know that unarmed Black people are shot by the police at 2 times the rate of unarmed white people. On a personal note, I too am part of the 1/3 of Black men in Colorado who've been to jail. Back in 2019, I spent about half a day in Jefferson County Jail because a police officer, after pulling over my friend who was driving us back from a mountain biking trip, asked for my information as well, and then found out that I had an unpaid parking ticket that I just wasn't aware of. The initial infraction that we were pulled over for was instantly forgotten. My white friends drove free. Meanwhile, my bail was set at $800 for a $50 ticket. So the point of that story and the statistics above are to illustrate that Black and brown people are not incarcerated more often just because we are more often in an income/wealth category that makes up some 90% of prison and jail populations in this country. I mean, that's a big part of it, but we're also policed differently. Now, part of the reason for systemic police discrimination and violence issues may come from lack of training. For instance, in Colorado, it takes 3 times as long to get certified as a hairdresser than it does to get certified as a police officer. In that training, police officers spend almost 60 hours training firearms and only 1 workday or 8 hours on de-escalation tactics. And finally, there's the incarceration cycle itself to blame for disproportionate crime rates. In 2018, NPR reported that the majority of the increase in crime that year was actually tied to recidivism and repeat offenders. Today, 50% of all people in prison in Colorado commit crimes again upon release. So for racial and ethnic groups that are overrepresented in corrections, jail can really be the death knell of opportunity for them, making crime and a second imprisonment seem worth the risk. Now, given the economic, mental health, substance, and housing stability related underpinnings of crime, and given that incarceration has such a high fail rate of keeping people from recommitting those crimes, you'd think that we'd spend our resources a little more strategically. However, that's not the case. Colorado spends about $1 billion per year on corrections, a number that has increased by over 1,000% since the 1990s. Looking at the municipal level, most cities in Colorado spend 30% or more of their budgets on traditional police and correction programs. In Denver, it's a little less, but the public safety budget is still 2 times that of human services. And even after the recently voter-approved $40 million per year fund to address homelessness that just passed, affordable housing will still only be a fraction of the city's $2.4 billion budget. Statewide, if you were to make a category called, public funding of shelter-type facilities, 3% of that budget would go to affordable housing and 97% to incarceration, housing people behind bars. So stepping back one more level and looking at the $32 billion or so budget that the state has to work with as a whole, we spend about 3% of it on corrections, but only 0.09% on affordable housing, rent, or homeownership programs. So the effect of all the above really compound to strengthen and entrench an unjust system. Number one, the way that we address crime in this state and across the country has direct impacts on our ability to address the housing, wealth, income, mental health, and substance issues discussed earlier. Because funds being tied up in that system means that there are fewer resources for human services, housing, etc. Number two, funds spent on traditional criminal justice practices, create a permanent underclass of residents who just can't get good jobs or good places to live after they're out. And so they often end up back in jail. Now, interestingly, many people think of criminal justice in terms of, the most sensationalized criminal stories that we see on the news, and then think, therefore, that without those status quo police programs, murder and other horrific crimes would just run rampant. The truth, however, is far less dramatic. Violent crime constitutes just less than 14% of all crime in Colorado, and most nonviolent crime is actually just a side effect of poverty, mental health, and substance misuse. Here are the numbers. Nonviolent theft constitutes about 75% of all crime in Colorado. And according to the Department of Justice, 40% of thefts are actually committed by people who are searching for funds to purchase drugs. In Denver, about 24% of crime is composed of disorderly conduct, trespassing, things that often have mental health or drugs at their root. And incredibly, homicide makes up less than 0.09% of all crime in Colorado. So, given the facts above, there's actually a host of cities across the country who are starting to try to address crime in new ways. So in the next slides, we'll start to look at some of these solutions. Today, alternatives to traditional criminal justice and corrections practices can be divided into the three basic categories below. First is housing first, where housing is treated as the first intervention to help people in need. Next is mental health, where mental health services are provided at the scene of 911 calls as an alternative to the police. Since about a quarter of all people fatally shot by the police have been estimated to have been having a mental health crisis at the time, this is incredibly important. Finally, there's housing and financial empowerment reentry programs, sometimes often called community reinvestment programs, where communities invest in programs that create housing and financial opportunities for people leaving the criminal justice system to prevent recidivism, and also in advance to prevent crime in the first place. For the housing first model, we'll look at Denver and Milwaukee. In Denver, the most recent program is called the Housing First Social Impact Bond, or the SIB program pilot. So in this program, the Mental Health Center of Denver and the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless located people throughout the city who were chronically homeless and invited them to live in the new apartment buildings they created. Now, the city had calculated that unhoused, this population was actually costing the city millions a year in public services. Think police time, social work time, temporary shelter costs, incarceration, medical costs, emergency room costs, etc. So, with a relatively small one-time investment in permanent housing with supports, the logic was that they could use the annual savings projections from that to finance the building. Well, 386 people accepted, and those in the program have seen a 50% to 70% decrease in arrests since being housed. From 2016 to 2020, the city accrued nearly $4 million in municipal savings from this program. And Milwaukee has been even more successful, seeing a 91% reduction in crime amongst those that they housed. Next is mental health. Now we know that a large percentage of police interactions happen because someone is having a mental health or substance misuse crisis. So for the past 30 years, the CAHOOTS program of Eugene, Oregon has been working to transfer the burden of 911 calls from the police to teams of medics and social workers. Today, that program successfully diverts 20% of all the city's 911 calls and saves an average of $8.5 million per year. Denver recently started a pilot program modeled after CAHOOTS called STAR, implemented by the Mental Health Center of Denver. Now, over the last year, it responded to over 750 different 911 calls, and not one of those calls had to be sent back to the police. Then there's reentry programs. The best examples of those in Colorado are really the Aurora Second Chance Center and the Reimagine program. The Second Chance Center model is simple: provide housing with supportive services to people who are exiting the criminal justice system. Now, despite a huge effort to keep this program from happening because people didn't want to live near or around people who were felons or ex-felons, they've actually reduced the recidivism rate of those that they house from 50% to 7%. Now, the WAGES program is a statewide initiative that focuses on pairing people, leaving incarceration with jobs, job training, education, etc. Folks in those programs only have a 2.5% recidivism rate. Then on the prevention side, there's the Justice Reinvestment Crime Prevention Initiative, also known as the Transforming Safety Program. This was a bill that was passed in 2017 to reinvest $4 million of state corrections funds into programs that created small business grants, loans, and financial education programs in high crime communities in Colorado Springs and Aurora. Now, unfortunately, this initiative lost funding over COVID, but this year there have been efforts to reinstate those funds. Preliminary information about how the program was doing was that it was going very well. In closing, given all that we've discussed and talked about so far in this module, here's a list of recommendations codifying all that we discussed into practical steps to address the racial inequities we face today. Number one, officially adopt and fund housing first, homeownership, and financial empowerment programs for disproportionately incarcerated BIPOC populations as core strategies for reducing police interactions and increasing public safety. By formalizing the proven connections between these things, we can compare the relative social and fiscal effectiveness of these programs and hopefully increase funding towards the end of addressing race and class justice system disparities. Now, given their virtually causal relationships displayed time and again, both in theory and in practice, this should be a no-brainer. Number two, officially adopt and fund targeted mental health alternatives to police engagement as a core strategy for reducing police interactions and improving overall public safety. The success of the CAHOOTS program in Oregon and STAR in Denver make a strong case for rolling out these programs across the state. Number three, reallocate funding of non-essential, non-human services mental health programs in police and corrections departments towards the aforementioned programs, and dramatically increase police de-escalation training. Now, this isn't a call to defund the police. This is a call to fund the police for immediate criminal justice issues best handled by them, and then fund other programs for the underlying socioeconomic and equity-related criminal justice issues that police are just not suited to handle. Number four, dramatically reduce incarceration rates for low-level offenses and dramatically increase funding for reentry and rehousing programs, treating them as a core strategy to reduce recidivism. All the other initiatives aside, if we don't do this, we're consigning 50% of the generation of currently incarcerated folks to a perpetually curtailed life. And we're leaving us bereft of all that they might have to offer society if they were given a real chance to rejoin it. Number five, build off the 2020 passage of the Enhanced Law Enforcement Integrity Bill, which limited the use of force, mandated body cams, instituted a mandate to intervene if an officer sees another officer using excessive force, to further increase accountability for police officers. We need to make it impossible for people in the police force for the wrong reasons to stay in the police force. In short, we need a force that attracts people like Officer Talley, the hero of the Boulder King super shooting, but existentially repels people like Officer Derek Chauvin. Now, unfortunately, Colorado has a history of half committing to radical change through the use of, or the overuse of, pilots. But given the urgency of the issue, the obvious problems with the public safety status quo, and the preponderance of evidence that these strategies strike at the core of the inequities underpinning the criminal justice system, the time for half measures has really passed. But to build the political will for this kind of change, we need people like you to speak with your local and state representatives to let them know that the current approach to public safety is neither effective, just, or safe, and that you want to change. With housing stability, homeownership, and financial empowerment as key anti-poverty and thus anti-crime strategies, mental health and de-escalation as key strategies to reduce violent police encounters, and reentry programs as a key strategy to ensure a valid path to opportunity for those who are already incarcerated, we really have a shot at raising the floor to create equity for people of all races, and hopefully a shot at moving towards a future where your zip code doesn't matter anymore. Thank you for joining me in this module of When Zip Code Doesn't Matter.